let us start. Welcome to the 23rd Goldstone Forum. The Goldstone Forum was initiated by a great benefactor of the philosophy, politics, and economics program, Stephen Goldstone, who was a graduate of political science here, and he was the CEO of Nabisco, so he could fund, us. And very interesting, he was very, very keen on inviting important, relevant people here, and I'm very happy to introduce today Jeffrey Sachs. So he's, of course, well known as a renowned economist, but he's also a great leader in sustainable development. And when I was looking at all the things he has done on his doing, the list of them, there were things I knew, but things I didn't know. For example, he had been advisor to governments, and I didn't know that he advised Gorbachev and Yeltsin in the transition to a market economy, and also Poland, by the way. He has been an advisor at the United Nations for different secretaries of secretary generals, and work on Millennium Development Goals. Okay. Now, he has also done a lot of practical work about alleviating poverty, ending common diseases, and I'm thinking of also a very interesting project, the Millennium Villages Project in Africa, in various areas, that covered more than 500,000 people. So this is a significant accomplishment. And also the nonprofit Millennial Promise Alliance, okay, and is chairing a commission on macro and health, very, very important for the World Health Organization. So in sum, Jeffrey Sachs embodies the ideal of using scientific expertise to drive meaningful change, blending innovation with a deep commitment to humanitarian goals. He not only pushes the boundaries of science, but also prioritizes the well-being of humanity, making him a true inspiration in both fields. So let's, tell him thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thanks for the PPE program. I wish that's what I had studied when I was studying. In fact, I came close, and I have to confess that I entered Harvard University in those days, many decades ago. There was a sophomore standing program, so that I entered as a sophomore, so I had to decide on my concentration immediately. And I thought I would study politics, which at Harvard was the government department. And I went to the government department office, and I said I would like to enroll in the government department. And they said, that's great. The first class that you'll take is political philosophy. And I said, no, I don't want to do philosophy. I want to do quantitative political science. They said, why don't you go across the way to the economics department? And that's how I became an economist. It was in the same building, literally right across the hall, and they did math. And so I didn't do philosophy for a long, long time, until many years of practice and economic work in many parts of the world, and realizing, of course, that every day you're doing philosophy, badly perhaps, or well, but every decision that you're making has an ethical dimension to it. It has fundamental political, philosophical issues involved. So I can say that I'm truly thrilled to be giving this year's Goldstone lecture for the PPE program, which is a wonderful concept and I know a world-leading program. I'm also very happy to be at Penn, which is a unique institution, and Penn had, as of course we all know, a unique founding president, Benjamin Franklin. And perhaps Ben Franklin said in one sentence what I want to say in an hour, or maybe in an hour and a half. Ben Franklin said, as is famously known in a letter in 1783, there's no such thing as a good war or a bad peace. And this is the truth. And it's especially true in the nuclear age. We're mad to be at war that can escalate to nuclear war. We're especially mad to say, oh, he's bluffing, whoever he happens to be. If it's President Putin, oh, he's bluffing about nuclear weapons. Or if it's President Xi, oh, he's bluffing about nuclear weapons. Grown-ups should never talk this way. There's no such thing as a good conflict, a good war between nuclear superpowers. And today we had a rather shocking late morning meeting in the Oval Office. And there are tweets and messages zooming around the world. But I want to say that President Trump, though it was not necessarily the way that one would like such meetings to go, is right. What he said to President Zelensky and those that are tweeting today that we stand with you, President Zelensky, are making a serious error. If you stand with Ukraine, which I do, and have for more than 30 years as an advisor to the President of Ukraine in 1993-94, as always on call for Ukraine whenever it asked for any economic advice, to stand with Ukraine is to stand for an end of this war, period. The longer this war goes on, the more dead and the more loss of territory, and the more likely is the utter destruction of Ukraine. Standing with continued war, as some of my friends in leadership in Europe are continuing to do, and saying we'll never side with peace, we'll never give in to Putin, that's not standing with Ukraine. That is violating Benjamin Franklin's very wise insight that there is no such thing as a good war. So I want to speak about our world today, about geopolitics, about why we have a war in Ukraine and how it should end, and I think it is ending, why we have a war in the Middle East and how it could end and is less likely to end on that basis, but should end, and why we are at risk of war in East Asia, and why we should avoid that at all costs. And all of those three theaters of conflict, in my mind, exemplify Benjamin Franklin's wisdom. Stay away from these wars. Not one of these issues that we're facing in the world is impervious to negotiation and diplomacy. And one particular idea of foreign policy that became popular in the United States and in some other places, that there's no one to talk to on the other side, that there's only an implacable foe on the other side, is almost always wrong. It's almost always sheer propaganda. It could be that in some cases, it could be that one is facing a psychopath. But even facing a psychopath, it's not necessarily wrong to try to talk, by the way. But the vast majority of time in the world, conflicts reflect political issues, and political issues cannot be solved by war. Political issues must be solved by diplomacy. And von Clausewitz, the most famous of war theorists in the modern Western tradition, of course, said that war is a continuation of politics with other means. I would say war is a failure of politics, but it always reflects a political set of issues. The war in Ukraine is not a war of recreating Peter the Great's empire or the Soviet Union, despite whatever propaganda one hears. The war in the Middle East is not a war against Hamas. This is absurd. This is a war about real issues, about Palestinian people, about justice, about rights, about international law. It's not an issue of stopping terrorism. That's propagandistic absurdity. And the issues in Asia are also not as simplistically put in the United States in recent years about fighting the Communist Party of China. In the US, if you say communist, it's a button that is being pushed. There is nothing in the world that has anything to do with that word that is involved in any issues that we have with China or anything in this world. That is just a mere emotional play by ignorant people, I have to say, in Washington, who for whatever reason provoke conflict. So this is what I want to try to put forward. It's based, I want to emphasize, on 45 years of working around the world with one overwhelming experience, and that is that it is absolutely possible to have good relations and friendship and dialogue and peace and mutual benefit with every single part of the world. I have not been to any place that I regard as an implacable enemy. I have not met any culture, any religion, race, far from it, in any place in the world where at least I wasn't warmly welcomed as a fellow human being trying to figure out how to make our way on this planet, and where I'm absolutely convinced that on every relevant issue we share vastly more with every other part of the world than anything that conceivably can divide us. I'll say one thing more about maybe philosophy, politics, and economics. In politics, the second P of your program, winning and losing is an issue. You run for office, or if you're in geopolitics, you view the world as winners and losers. In economics, the entire idea of the economics profession, and it was codified in 1776 by Adam Smith, who explained it brilliantly for the first time in a deeply analytical way. Economic relations are win-win relations. They're not win-lose relations. If you're trained as an economist, you can't really see the world as winners and losers. You see the world as the gains from trade. And Adam Smith's core idea was the larger the market, the more scope there is for gains from trade. The more benefits there can be from specialization and from, as he said, relieving each other's wants in different parts of the world. And this is a core truth. And so I have to say, maybe it's my trained incapacity, but I find it very hard to think in win-lose terms. I find it very hard to think in America first or anybody else first. It's not even a meaningful concept in my view. What is meaningful is well-being. Meaningful is quality of life. Meaningful is making progress at eliminating deprivations or harms. Meaningful is benefiting from each other and truly benefiting from the diversity of the world. Otherwise, we have very bland diets every day. I couldn't even have my morning coffee because it comes from Ethiopia or Colombia or Java or Honduras or Brazil. And that's one of the most important things in my day. So it's unimaginable to me that we would close our borders, close our societies, close our cultures, close our minds to the benefits with the rest of the world. So why are we so confused right now? We're in a period of tremendous, unprecedented, and truly historic scale change, disruption of standard ideas and standard models of the world. And these years that we're living in, even these hours sometimes, are absolutely remarkable in the disruptions to the normal order that they're bringing about. And to understand the conflicts and to understand the peace solutions, we have to understand what is going on in this world that makes it seem so jittery, so disrupted, so in many ways unprecedented or uncharted. And I would like to put forward a few propositions. First, on the economic front, we're in a remarkable phase of history that can be summarized in one basic concept called economic convergence. Economic convergence is the idea that poorer countries can catch up with richer countries. It's rather natural that that should be the case, in fact, because poorer countries are poor typically because they lack capital, they lack infrastructure, they lack investments, maybe for historical reasons, they lack education of the population, maybe because they were colonized or subject to imperial rule or subject to war or some other reason. But that means that that relative lack gives headroom for very rapid progress. Why is it that China could achieve 10% per year economic growth from 1980 to 2020? 10% per year, by the way, means that the economy doubles every 7 years. And if you do that for 35 years, that's 5 doublings. So that is a 32-fold increase of GDP, and they did it for more than 35 years. So they've had more than a 30-time rise of the size of the economy. What made that possible? Well, what made that possible was in 1980, China was extraordinarily poor, very poor. We had the good fortune, my wife and I, to visit China in 1981. There wasn't, of course, a private vehicle anywhere on the roads. There was one dress code, a Mao suit, whether it was street sweepers or people in the shops or people that were our tour guides or anybody else. It was impoverished. It was so impoverished that the United States gave it not a second thought. That's a country that plays ping pong. That's all the U.S. knew. This is not a country that is more than rice-growing villages, and it's an impoverished country, but at least it's it can help us in our dealings with the Soviet Union. That's what the United States knew. But from an economic point of view, in 40 years, China became the world's largest economy, which it is today, about 30% larger than the United States, if measured at international prices. It's not a miracle, it's a great success, but it comes from the fact that China started very, very poor. There are other countries that achieved similar gains, but at a much smaller population scale, so they didn't transform the world the same way. But all through East Asia, this kind of experience was achieved. with Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea. All of these countries, plus China, achieved this rapid economic convergent growth. So I want to start there because this is going to happen all over the world. And it is a distinctive change in the world because for about 150 years, from 1800 to 1950, not only was there no economic convergence, one could say that remarkably it was an age of divergence, which meant that the rich just kept getting richer and pulling away from the rest of the world, rather counter to how economics should work. So what happened that changed 1800 to 1950 and then 1950 till today? One, an era of widening gaps, one, an era of narrowing gaps. What happened essentially was that the first 150 years was the age of high European imperialism. And imperial powers don't let their colonial dependencies develop. They don't allow it. They don't educate the populations. They don't build the infrastructures except to the mines or to the plantations where they're exploiting the resources. So for the first 150 years, it was Europe beating up on the rest of the world and essentially colonizing most of the world, or even when it wasn't a direct colonial relationship, it was a quasi-imperial or quasi-colonial relationship, as with China at the end of the 19th century, with extraterritoriality and many other indignities visited on China. Europe, the imperial powers, had two civil wars. We call them World War I and World War II. They were devastating. And after essentially 30 years of war in Europe, the imperial age of Europe was over through this kind of European political suicide, and the rest of the world became free, one step after another, sometimes quickly, sometimes after prolonged wars in the case of Vietnam. And that's what opened up the possibility of economic convergence. But I'm highlighting this because of its geopolitical implication, which is the second main point for us to really understand. And it's only in the last few weeks that a basic idea has been enunciated. Because of economic convergence, we are truly in a multipolar world. We're not in a US-led world. The idea was for a long time in this country, we will lead the world. In the 19th century, we will build a continental nation, manifest destiny. And pretty much as soon as that was done, as Frederick Turner noted with this end of the closing of the frontier around 1890, the U.S. went to search for its overseas empires almost immediately to try to catch up with the European overseas empires. So we toppled a kingdom in Hawaii and then went to war on false pretenses with Spain and began building an overseas empire. For 150 years, Europe and the United States were the economic dominant powers. After World War II, of course, the United States was not only the economic dominant power, something that it had become by around 1890 in the world, but now indisputably the geopolitical power of the world. And as everybody knows, this was given a name in 1941 by the publisher of Time Incorporated, Henry Luce, that this was now the American century. And so the idea, which he said in that essay, was America needs to pick up the mantle and take global leadership. And after World War II, the United States was perhaps 30% of world output. We were the only standing economy in the world. We were technologically so far ahead of almost everyone else, as well as for 4 years having a monopoly of the atomic bomb, that the United States looked that it actually did run the world. And for a number of years, the United States built global institutions, the most important of which is the United Nations, and all its family of institutions, as part of that vision of American leadership. The problem is that stuff goes to your head. And the real problem is that it's nice to have that notion if you're also infused with a good touch of arrogance and with a good touch of evangelism, which is deeply in the American soul and political ideology. You can really overdo it. Every great power in history has believed that they are a great power because they are uniquely blessed, typically by God and by something else, some other forces. And the United States was no exception. And the United States, one of the architects of the early post-World War II world, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State of Harry Truman, wrote his memoirs called Present at the Creation. It's a little strange idea, but it's a mindset. The mindset is this was the creation of a whole new world order. I have to say, as a young, starting out economist, out to help promote economic development in the world, I could not have been more proud to be an American. I thought, this is a country that made the Marshall Plan, this is a country that made the UN, this is a country that invented development aid. And I felt that way. And so there was something also in the spirit and this is the country that landed on the moon in 1969. And this is the country that had produced John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, my first political loves. So there was this feeling of exuberance. But I think J. William Fulbright, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1960s and was a very brilliant, one of our greatest politicians of the 20th century, was right in also one of the earliest political tracks that I ever held. He wrote a book in, I think it's 1966, called The Arrogance of Power. And he said, we are arrogant. And that arrogance has led us to Vietnam, to the debacle that we're experiencing in Vietnam. Well, my proposition is that America came to believe that it ran the world. In the 1990s, it enunciated this in a number of ways. Probably most famously, Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, in his second term, said, we are the indispensable nation. And that was not a rhetorical flourish. That was a deeply held belief. The arrogance I came to see in my professional life, starting in the 1980s, because there were many things that struck me as very, very odd and very unpleasant about American foreign policy, and I hated the Vietnam War and so forth. It was my first protest movement. But it was really starting in 1991 that the arrogance went into full overdrive, because that is the year in which the Soviet Union ended. And I, at the time, was advising the economic team of Mikhail Gorbachev, who I regard as the greatest statesman of the modern period, who is reviled in his country because he's remembered as the one that led to high inflation and economic collapse and the loss of the Soviet Union. But what he did was spoke about peace on a global scale and called for an end of the Cold War on the basis of peace. It didn't quite happen that way, because on the one hand, well, I should add one quick footnote. My idea was, let's help this man. I had studied economic history for enough, and I had practiced economic development and economic stabilization for enough time to know if another country's in crisis, they need some help. And part of the help in a case like the Soviet crisis of the late 1980s and early 1990s is financial help, because the kind of crisis that the Soviet Union had was a financial crisis as well as a structural and political crisis. So I argued for financial help. Well, this was viewed as a kind of nutty idea in the American political circles. Why would we help the enemy? And I said, they're not the enemy, they're the peaceful counterpart trying to make reforms. No, they're the enemy. Recently, someone sent me the National Security Council minutes, which were released in a Freedom of Information Act a while ago, that describes how they dumped on my proposal in a meeting in June 1991. And one of my former colleagues, who was then at the he was then in the White House at OMB, said, "This is ridiculous. We will do the minimum that we can do without a collapse. We're not going to help." And it's all there in the minutes. That was the American view in 1991. Gorbachev fell from power after an attempted putsch, and Boris Yeltsin came to power, and the Soviet Union ended. And I actually sat directly in front of Boris Yeltsin in mid-December. I don't know the date. I will have to figure it out. He walked from that door to the table where I was leading a small delegation, and he sat down in front of me and he said, "Gentlemen," because it was all men, he said, "Gentlemen, the Soviet Union is over," in the Kremlin. And I was the next to speak, and I said, "The United States, Mr. President, will help you at this absolutely critical moment for making peace and goodwill in the world." And of course, I was completely wrong. So the United States didn't lift a finger to help. Couldn't care less, except that now the enemy was on the ropes. I thought the Cold War was over. No, that was very naive. The Cold War was just getting started, but in a different way. The US had defeated the Soviet Union. Now the US would bring Russia into the American-led system. This was the basic idea from 1991 onward. And I saw a lot of it very close up. The core idea of the United States in geopolitical terms was, we now run the show. Soviet Union is over. There is no possible competitor on the horizon anywhere in the world. Believe me, the word China didn't come up anywhere in those years. No one could imagine that China was a competitor, because they don't know any economics also. But the arrogance was also there. We had one of your speakers, one of the first speakers in this series, Paul Krugman, wrote a paper called "The Myth of the East Asian Miracle," because it was very popular in economic circles. I never agreed with it, that, oh, that's just a fluff. There's nothing there. Still, even today, the Nobel Prize laureate this past year, Darren Acemoglu's main book is to explain why China can't succeed. Okay, have it your way. But in any event, China was absolutely not on the radar screen, and the United States says, we run the world, and Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, became the Bible of the 1990s. The world history is over. The US is the hegemon, liberal democracy, quote unquote. It's a very loaded phrase, by the way, which means almost nothing, except that the US can define what it wants. But other than that, that was the idea. That world is over now. That's what is absolutely important to understand. So economic convergence brings a second phenomenon, which is fundamental geopolitical change. And the fundamental geopolitical change is that no country has a monopoly on technology, no country has a monopoly on knowledge, no country has a monopoly on military force, no country has a monopoly on trade and finance. No country can say, we're number one and we're going to stay number one, and there's nothing that anyone else can do. But that became the US ideology. That became the ideology of primacy or liberal hegemony, however one wants to define it. Sometimes it's called the neoconservative philosophy. But it took hold in 1991, and it has been with us until actually this new administration. The ground reality changed decisively already 15 years ago. The world is a multipolar world. China is a powerful, successful superpower. Russia is a powerful, large, successful country. India is a largest population in the world, a nuclear superpower, and a fast-growing country, albeit still poorer than China. And other regions will also rapidly develop. My prediction, and when you invite me back in 40 years, we'll check how I did, but my prediction is that the next 40 years will be a period of very rapid growth of Africa. And Africa will have a large population, about 2.5 billion people or more, around 2060, and it will have an economy vastly larger in per person terms than it does now, and it will be one of the centers of the world economy, completely different from the current perception, because that's what economic convergence makes possible. So we're in a very different geopolitical environment. Why did we have this massive dust-up in the White House today of Trump and Zelensky? The reason is essentially the following. Starting in 1991, and then starting in implementation in 1994, the US unipolar world was put into motion. And the most important way that it was put into motion was the expansion of NATO. What is NATO? NATO is a US military alliance. It was created in 1949 for what? To defend against a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The Soviet Union ended in December 1991. A good time to end NATO, by the way. It had a purpose, the purpose was gone. But NATO was repurposed starting in 1994 to be the front edge of American military presence in all parts of the world. And actually, just until a few weeks ago, NATO under Biden was talking about opening the offices in Japan, establishing its presence in East Asia. Almost a mind-boggling provocation, especially since the NATO enlargement in Europe was the cause of the war that we have in Ukraine. In 1991, when negotiations were taking place starting on German reunification, which required an agreement of the parties that had been the victors of World War II, because Germany's division legally was the unmet agenda with the lack of a peace treaty after World War II. When German reunification was on the table, the US and Germany said to Gorbachev in 1990 that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. You have probably heard that line, and you've probably heard that it is denied or not true. It's true. It was said repeatedly. It's all thoroughly documented in the National Security Archives and many, many other places, and many histories, including an excellent history by Jonathan Haslam, Harvard University Press, 2024, called Hubris, analogous to arrogance. So we said no NATO enlargement. Of course, Clinton started NATO enlargement in 1994. In 1999, first wave of NATO enlargement was begun with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, the second wave of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, 7 countries in 2004. And then the United States said in 2008, Ukraine and Georgia. And President Putin said, no, that's our border. You stay away from our border. And the United States said, who's that? Who's that telling us what to do? We're the United States of America. He's the leader of a third-rate country. We do what we want. And that is what American foreign policy really was. Ukraine elected a president in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, who said we should be neutral. Which, by the way, if you look at a map, what a good idea. If you are where Ukraine is, the first bit of wisdom is don't antagonize the one just to our east. Just be cool. My advice to the Mexicans, don't allow China to build a military base on the Rio Grande. Not a good idea. If the next Canadian Prime Minister says, well, he wants Canada to be the 51st state, why don't we have a Russian military base in Windsor, Ontario? Not a good idea. The United States would invade in about 10 minutes. But for us, putting our military base in Ukraine, that's our business. That's Ukraine's business. That has nothing to do with Russia. We call that the open door policy. So we have something called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, repeated by President Trump frequently, which says, don't come anywhere near our entire hemisphere, thank you. But the United States says, we will go with NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, which if you look at a map, I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia, I mean Tbilisi, Georgia, in the Southern Caucasus, that should not have a U.S. military base. And similarly, the United States should not be sending arms to Taiwan. Look at a map. Look at our communiques. Look at our foreign policy. We should not be sending arms to Taiwan, and China should not send arms to Tennessee. No matter whether Tennessee wants the armaments or not. Don't interfere internally. So we never got that. Ukraine elected a president that wanted neutrality, and the U.S. helped to overthrow him on February 22nd, 2014. I happened to see some of that a bit up close, not before the overthrow, but just after the overthrow, that some of the unpleasantness was explained to me firsthand. But the U.S. played a role in that coup. Well, the Russians knew it. They actually intercepted a call from my colleague at SIPA at Columbia University, Victoria Nuland, my fellow professor, who was the lead point person for the coup for the United States. And she was talking to her counterpart in the State Department, who was the ambassador, Jeffrey Sachs, and they were planning the next government on the phone. The Russians intercepted the call and they put it on the internet, which was helpful. So everybody can listen to what a regime change operation is like in an unguarded moment by the United States. Don't talk on your cell phone. This is not a good idea. So if you're planning a regime change operation, at least use Signal, but they've cracked that too, so don't have too much confidence in that. We went to war over this issue. Putin said no to U.S. missile systems near the border. We said it's our business. We said no to NATO on Russia's border. We said it's an open door, Article 10 of the NATO treaty. It's none of your business where our military bases go. And that's why we have a war. The war, by the way, could have ended. Now I'm going to turn to solutions. The war could have ended. The war could have been avoided at the end of 1991 easily. I tried to suggest to Jake Sullivan how that could easily be done. I said, why don't you have your boss call President Putin and say, you know, NATO's not going to enlarge. And then you could avoid the war, Jake. And he said to me, oh, NATO's not going to enlarge Ukraine. And I said, Jake, you're going to have a war over something that's really not going to happen? Then say it publicly. And he said, no, we can't say it publicly. We have an open door policy. And he said, and we're not going to have a war. And I said, Jake, you're going to have a war. You have to respond. We had a war that has already taken 1 million casualties of Ukrainians. Hundreds of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands gravely wounded for absolutely no reason. In March 2022, Zelensky at that point said, we'll be neutral. Said it publicly, said it in interviews in the Financial Times. And the Ukrainians told the Russians that. And the Russians said, if you want that, let's negotiate. Give us a document. And the Ukrainians gave them a document, and it went to President Putin. President Putin said, yes, we can negotiate peace on this basis. And Turkey became the mediators of that in what is now called the Istanbul process. And I went to speak to the Turkish mediators, and they were just about closing a deal. And then one day, the Ukrainians didn't show up and said, we're not coming back to the negotiating table. What happened? What happened is the United States said, don't negotiate on the basis of neutrality. We have your back. You're going to join NATO. It's okay. We've got good missile systems for you. We have HIMARS. We have ATACMS. We're going to crush the Russian economy with our sanctions. We're going to cut Russia out of the dollar-based banking system. Don't worry about it. Then they sent Boris Johnson. If that doesn't terrify you, I don't know what does. They sent Boris Johnson in early April to Kiev. If I were Zelensky at that point, I said, if you're sending this guy, I'm out of here. But in any event, Boris Johnson told them, you have to continue to fight. And Boris Johnson later explained that Western hegemony depends on victory. This isn't about Ukraine, this is about Western hegemony. Who gets to say who goes where in the world? So what President Trump is saying is right. And he doesn't say it in exactly the artful way that he might. But on the other hand, I've never seen such weirdness in Europe and intransigence in Ukrainian leadership, which really is given an opportunity to get out of this absolute devastation. Now, one thing is just important to add as a footnote. Excuse me. Before February 22nd, 2014, Russia never expressed an iota of demand for any territory. There were no territorial demands. There was no claims of territorial aggrandizement. When the coup came, Russia took back Crimea. Why? Because Crimea is the home of the Russian naval fleet and has been since 1783, when Sevastopol was established by Catherine the Great. So that is their naval base. And it is the naval base that allows them to project their power into the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is exactly for that reason that Britain and France went to war with Russia in 1853 in the Crimean War to try to push Russia out of the Black Sea. And it's the reason for the war today, because NATO enlargement, including to Georgia, is not a coincidence of a list of countries. The idea is that Russia would be surrounded by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all in a pincer in the Black Sea, thereby surrounding Russia, thereby relegating Russia essentially to a land power. And the idea of Palmerston and Brzezinski and others was that would make Russia a third-rate power that could not project its power through naval power. So Russia had took Crimea for that reason, because it did not want the naval base to fall into NATO hands after a coup in which the United States had participated actively. But it did not call for any annexation of any other territory. On the contrary, it said that there should be autonomy for the Russian-speaking region of eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region, after the coup. The idea of autonomy, by the way, is a very familiar idea all through the world and all through Europe, as a matter of fact. And the agreement for autonomy, called the Minsk Agreement, was modeled actually on the South Tyrol autonomy of the German-speaking region within Italy. Literally modeled on that, because Angela Merkel knew the experience of South Tyrol and used that as a basis for the Minsk Agreement for autonomy for these two provinces, Lugansk and Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine. That autonomy of Minsk II was voted by the UN Security Council, and then the United States said to the Ukrainians, forget it. You don't have to do that. We don't think that that's a good idea. You don't have to divide your country. You have a unitary country. Forget it. And the Minsk II agreement was never implemented. When the invasion occurred on February 22nd, 2020, February 24th, 2022, the Russian demand was not that we're going to annex the Donbass. The Russian demand was that there must be neutrality and implementation of the Minsk II agreement. The annexation came months later, at the end of September 2022, after the collapse of the negotiations. Then the Russian Duma voted to annex 4 rayons, or 4 oblasts, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. But it was not a demand of the war. It was not a Russian demand. The Russians were not demanding territory. And yet our newspapers portrayed this as a war of territorial expansion, a recreation of the Russian Empire, and the favorite word of the completely useless New York Times, which is phony from morning till night, and then on the website from night till morning, is that this was an unprovoked war. There wasn't a day where they explained any of the history of how we came to this fact. I know it because I begged them to do it. And then I begged them, give me 700 words one day, online, not even in print. Let me write something. No, never happened. Couldn't get into the paper. I told them, I know something. I've been there for 30 years. I have dealt with the leaders. Let me write 700 words. Impossible. So this is what the situation is. How is this war now going to end? The sooner the better, according to Benjamin Franklin. Make peace. Ukraine now will lose these territories. It will be neutral, and it will be a sovereign, independent country at peace. And Russia is not going to invade the rest of Europe. This is completely fatuous. So that's it. It's not even hard. Donald Trump has figured it out. But strangely enough, everyone that invested into this project, which was a 30-year project, is finding it very hard to retool quickly because they've been on one line, one track, spent a lot of money, cost a lot of lives, and even Bernie Sanders today tweeted in the full defense of Zelensky in the meeting today, "We're with you." Well, Senator Sanders, and I advised him in his 2016 campaign, if you're with, and in 2020, if you're with him, ask for peace to save everybody's lives at this point. Let me say, and I won't go on endlessly droning, every conflict in the world that I know of has political underpinnings, is not unprovoked, has reasons, and has therefore ways of solution. And what we should be doing is having not only a philosophy of peace, but a study of peacemaking to understand how one moves from war to peace by understanding the nature of the conflicts and understanding what is the way to solve the conflicts. I'll just say quickly 2 points, one about the Middle East and one about the US and China. The Middle East has been at war, a war between Israel and the Palestinian people since before there was Israel. The conflict of this region has been going on essentially since the early 1920s, and it has not abated until today. At this point, there are 8 million Arab Palestinians and 8 million Jews. There need to be either a binational state or 2 states, period. There cannot be one Israel that dominates and rules over 8 million people, nor can we accept as a means of peace an ethnic cleansing or a slaughter or an expulsion of millions of people. This is very plain. This has been obvious for decades. I first went to Israel in 1972, so it's 53 years ago. In 1972, Israel had started putting illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, which Israel had captured 5 years earlier in the 1967 war. I was told, I was a high school student, and they explained to me, we're putting facts on the ground. Okay, that's facts to make endless war, which they have done. There are now, as you know, hundreds of thousands of settlers who from the first day were settling illegally and known to be illegally and told that it was illegal every day, every year since 1969 when the Alone Plan began. Why? Because for a variety of reasons, Israeli leaders said, we will never accept Palestine as a co-equal country next to us or as a part of a unified binational entity. We are a Jewish state, and we will never allow there to be a Palestinian state. And in the 1970s, a new party emerged, the Likud party. That's the party of Benjamin Netanyahu. And they used an interesting line in their founding document that Israel should rule from the river to the sea. a statement that is a rather fraught statement these days. But it is a statement of actual purpose of the leading Israeli party, which is that there should be one state, not two, and one Jewish state, not a binational state. Well, there can never be peace on this basis. There can't be justice on this basis. This is obvious. And it's not hard to see. What is Netanyahu's plan for after fighting Hamas? Well, we know what the actual plan is. The actual plan is ethnic cleansing or expulsion of the people. Now it's becoming more and more explicit. But it's interesting, there's never been, as far as I know, almost a sentence said about what the plan is. The only statement is, we must destroy Hamas, we must destroy Hamas. Because there can't be an explicit statement of the politics. Because the politics that the Israeli government is pursuing is completely contrary to international law, completely contrary to international justice, and completely contrary to peace. It's impossible to have peace on the basis that Israel is trying to have peace. The strange part of all of this is that the United States has played along, completely complicit in this view, since the 1990s. And the way that it has been complicit is also, as is often the case, very clearly on the documentary record. Netanyahu, when he first came to be prime minister in 1996, had American political advisors around him, and they produced a document called Clean Break. And the idea of clean break was, explicitly, we won't have land for peace, we'll have what they call peace for peace. In other words, we keep the land, and we'll have peace. And Netanyahu's, now that I've gone back to read and listen to his speeches and read his books, is very, very clear, very explicit, which is fascinating because many of these political leaders are absolutely clear. And Netanyahu's theory is, if anyone doesn't like it, like Hamas or Hezbollah, we'll just overthrow any other government that is supporting Hamas or Hezbollah. So Netanyahu explained in many speeches and writings, you don't fight the terrorists, you fight the states that support them. And so the United States has been in nonstop wars in the Middle East on Israel's behalf. Not in Israel's interest, but in Netanyahu's ideological approach to overthrow the Syrian government, to overthrow the Iraqi government, to overthrow the Libyan government, to overthrow the Sudanese government, nonstop. And there's a very wonderfully fascinating book that was written last year by a man named Dennis Fritz, who was a senior official in the U.S. Air Force. And he was asked, strangely enough, to read through all of the background of the Iraq War. Why did it happen? Why was he asked that? He was asked that because the boss wanted to write memoirs. And so the boss wanted papers declassified. So they made a declassification project in which this man, very knowledgeable, led the effort. He read the background just like Daniel Ellsberg read the Pentagon Papers. He read the papers about the lead up to the Iraq War back 20 years ago. He didn't write a book then. He anguished about this for 20 years. Last year he wrote the book. It's called Deadly Betrayal. And he explains how the Iraq War was Netanyahu's war. Very interesting. Netanyahu with his counterparts in the Pentagon, Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith. And he explains all of this. He even shows the documents. They're all blacked out because the US redacts them in our wonderful democracy. We can't read the real documents, but we can see glimpses of the documents. And he describes the documents without quoting them so that he stays out of even more harm's way. But the point is, we've been at war for decades. because of a basic proposition, which is that we will follow Israel's lead to reject a state of Palestine. Now, just to close on this, to have a state of Palestine requires one change, and that is the American veto in the UN Security Council. Last year, Palestine came for membership as the 194th UN member state, and the vote was 12-1 with 2 abstentions. The one was the US vetoing. The world, 95% of the world population lives in countries that have voted either in the General Assembly or the UN Security Council for the 2-state solution. Everybody supports it, except for Netanyahu and his colleagues, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others. But the rest of the world, other than the US as its backer, supports the 2-state solution. And not just the 2-state solution, the 2-state solution according to international law, which is that the state of Palestine's borders would be the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, with capital in East Jerusalem. This is not hard. I've spoken to foreign ministers all over the world in recent weeks and months. They would normalize relations with Israel. They would make sure that insurgency stopped. They would stop financing any of the military and so forth, any of the resistance, if there's a state of Palestine. So this is one step away. Our politics are not so easy. You've seen it at Penn. We've seen it at Columbia. It's not so easy. But it's also not so hard to bring a century of war in the Middle East to an end in a very practical way that abides by international law. Finally, let me say a word about the US-China conflict. This is really easy, and I can be short. There is no reason for any conflict at all between the US and China. There's no conflict of interest at all. There's good economic competition, but that's all. China's a long way away. They are not going to invade California. They may try to get some engineers. They may try to get some venture capital, but they're not going to invade. And you know what? The same thing is true. The United States cannot defeat China in East Asia if it came to blows. It's impossible. Thousands of miles away, China is a formidable military power. Not to mention the fact that just as with Ukraine, for Russia, this is existential. For China, a fight in East Asia is existential. For the United States, it's a game. So we have no reason for conflict. Probably the most important reform we could have is to get some passports for U.S. congressmen to go see the world. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions, and there are microphones all over, so don't worry. Okay. You?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm an economist, as you are, so I'm very glad that you came to give a talk. It was wonderful. So my question is the following. So you talked about the big superpowers coming up, China, Russia, US, India, and you also talked about Africa possibly being like a new center of economic growth in the next 40 years. You didn't mention Europe too much, so I'm European.
Yes.
So I'm concerned about what is going to be the role of Europe that you see in the forthcoming years. You know, as European, I see Europe being like quite divided, politically speaking. There's not much confidence in our European Parliament. You know, we see government switching from right to left, left to right. The only thing that I guess, was kind of like a security for us in Europe, was that Germany was the leading economic power, but seems not to be the case anymore. So I'm just wondering,
Where are you from?
What are your thoughts? From Italy.
Italy, great.
Yeah. So,
My favorite place. I was at the European Parliament last week, and you can look online to a talk that I gave in the EU Parliament about Europe needing a foreign policy. Europe doesn't have a foreign policy, of course. The European Union is, I think, a wonderful creation, but very flawed. And it is something like what the US had briefly in the 1780s, because when the US, when the War of Independence ended, the US was governed for effectively for 7 years by the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation was a constitution in which the 13 states that were now sovereign states would cooperate with each other, but they couldn't make a foreign policy. There was no federal government. In fact, to make taxes, they needed unanimity. It was very much like the EU, basically. A little bit less institutionalized, but the idea was, no, it was a confederacy, not a federacy. It was extremely weak, and it was dysfunctional. And a political entrepreneur in the United States, so one particular entrepreneur, James Madison, figured out how to get a constitutional convention going, indeed, as you know about, and it paid off. A constitution was adopted. And Europe is going to need to do something like this, actually. Europe needs a new treaty. Europe needs a new arrangement because the existing structure doesn't work, actually. This is sad to say. And it probably can't even be fixed exactly the way it is right now. So Europe, as 27 would be, are very divided anyway. But the idea was, we got the US behind us. Now they got Donald Trump behind us. Oh my God. And who wants to maybe invade Denmark, Greenland in particular. I would not put it past him, by the way, that one day troops land on Greenland because it's a US national security emergency. I'm not predicting it, but it wouldn't be so far-fetched. So Europe mostly gave its foreign policy to the US, but not always, interestingly, because there were periods where European leaders said no to the US. And actually, maybe the high point of that was the Iraq War, where there was a lot of European opposition to the Iraq War in 2003, and quite outspoken opposition, and the world survived. Where Europe, in my opinion, ended a foreign policy was in 2008. And it was Mrs. Merkel, unfortunately, Chancellor Merkel, because when the US called for expanding NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, she and Sarkozy, the president of France, knew this was really a bad idea. And they went to the NATO summit in Bucharest, and George W. looked at them and said, well, and they said, well, it's a bad idea. Well, and by the second day, they folded their hands. And the compromise was, we won't have a specific date, but we will announce that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. And that was the outcome of the Bucharest summit, and it was the last time that I can see that Europe had an independent foreign policy of any kind. Europe became NATO. And NATO is the US, or has been up until today, the US, and Europe lost it. I spoke to a political leader in Europe recently, said, why don't you stand up to this? This was during the Biden period, and he said, well, they treat us like children in Washington. And I thought, my God, you're the leader of a major country a lot older than the United States. Why don't you not be treated like a child? I didn't ask that question, but I felt that question very painfully. So inside Europe now, however, the situation is bizarre in the short term. Trump is really, he has absolutely no historical, professional, emotional, or policy allegiance to Europe at all. At all. Not enough golf courses there. I don't know what it is. But there's no feeling at all there. There really isn't. So Europe needs to do something. But what is Europe doing? Europe is doubling down, just in recent weeks, doubling down on the old strategy. We'll continue the war whether the United States does or not. Are you kidding? You can't continue the war. Even with the US, we can't continue the war. Without the United States, there's no possibility at all. So Europe has not found any leadership right now. Macron makes no sense. He says to me things in private and the opposite in public. I know that's not original, but it's striking. We don't have any place in Europe with the lead, and where is the foreign policy nominally situated? In the Estonian former prime minister, who is the most Russophobic politician in Europe. And so she conveys everyday hatred towards Russia. That's not a foreign policy, not even remotely a foreign policy. And my argument to Europe is, then Europe, when Trump said we're going to meeting with Putin and so forth, Europe said, oh, we need to be at the table. You don't need to be at that table. Fly to Moscow. Invite Putin to come to Rome. It's okay. Not hard. You don't have to be at the US table. You be at the European table. So in substance, Europe is 450 million people, first of all. The United States, 335 million people. Europe is a nuclear superpower without power. It's got a nuclear deterrent, which is French. It has a $20 trillion economy, which is number 2. It depends, again, how everything's measured. Number 2 or number 3 in the world. It's got 2,000 years of civilizational history compared to about 250 years of this country. And so Europe should be doing something. But the Baltic states are terrified and are completely on the wrong track, because just my advice to you, if you live next to someone who's nasty or irascible, looks a little bit dangerous, don't make fun of them every day. Don't throw shit in their front yard. Don't yell at them, say, you're so stupid, I don't know how you can be my neighbor. Why don't you just go to hell? Don't do that. That's a good way to get killed, actually. So, really, it's honestly true. It's not hard to see. There needs to be some diplomacy. And the problem in the European rhetoric, which is even worse than the US rhetoric, actually, which is surprising to me, because I love Europe, and I cannot understand. But there's no willingness at all to acknowledge any history to this conflict at all, other than an unprovoked invasion starting on February 24th, 2022. And I have been canceled in Europe in giving talks. Rooms have been closed. Sponsors have pulled out, because to talk about this you can't do. It's very weird, actually. Really strange. And quite dangerous for Europe. Very dangerous for Europe. Europe is not safe unless it's unified right now. And it can be unified. By the way, I'm not a pacifist. I'm against war, but I'm also If Europe wants to build its military, fine. Don't buy U.S. military. Donald Trump is a weapons salesman. If you want to build a military, design and build your own, have R&D in Europe. It's, strangely enough, military R&D is so central to technological advance more generally that you always find that it's the militarized countries that have the most dynamic technologies because a lot of it spills out from the military sector. But Europe doesn't do that. It buys US products. That's ridiculous. So if Europe does want to expand, at least buy European, like Airbus, but on the military side. And I think that that would be a very good strategy. Is this going to happen? It could happen faster than we think, actually. Mertz said one clever thing, many not so clever things, but one very clever thing. The new Chancellor of Germany, he said we have to prepare for being separate from the United States. That's the beginning of wisdom. Then he said we're going to stand with Ukraine and all the rest. So that wasn't so helpful for Ukraine or for Germany. But there's an understanding now that something's different. And if some not common sense, if some knowledge, if some sophistication can be brought to this, Europe could look in a lot stronger, wiser, safer place a year from now than it does.
Thanks. There are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more questions. The first is here, then 2, 3.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I also think a lot about multipolarity of the world. And as a test of this thesis, I have one example that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So in 2015, Iran signed a nuclear agreement with the whole world, the world powers, and heavily supported by Europe. Donald Trump gets elected after Obama, violates the deal, and unilaterally withdraws from it. And Europe musters a lot of energy to revive the deal, and it's been 8 years since then. The deal hasn't been revived, and they haven't been able to put any sort of financial instrument for transactions. It seems to me that the United States is still today can bully the rest of the world and come across as this, sole power that does what it wants. And I would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah.
How can I understand multipolarity and then also incidents like this, the United States can bully Europe and the rest of the world?
So, the U.S. thought that it could bully Putin and that Russia would have no alternative. So the Ukraine war is a kind of test of this proposition. And in fact, in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard in 1997, he has a chapter where he explains how Russia will have no alternative but to give in to the U.S. expansion. It's wrong, but it's there, very vivid. So I believe that the U.S. is vastly exaggerated in its power. I believe that Trump, for example, thinks that the U.S. market is the be-all and end-all, so if he threatens with tariffs, everyone's going to fall into line, so that this is a great instrument for threats. It's not the case. The U.S. share of world trade is, depending on, again, how things are measured, about 12% for the U.S. market of total imports in the world. And China can figure out how to thrive without expanding its exports to the United States, even with the decline of exports. Yes, there will be disruptions in the short term, but countries won't fall all over themselves for abiding by the demands of the United States. Iran now is a member of the BRICS. As I mentioned, the BRICS countries are 10 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia. And those 10 countries have 41% of world output and 46% of world population. Not bad. And Trump said, they're dead because I said so, which is very interesting because the BRICS is talking about how to make settlements outside of the US dollar payment system so that the US extraterritorial sanctions don't have the bite that they now have. Now the US says, don't trade with Russia, and any bank that would give a letter of credit or close a transaction that also operates in the dollar banking system, the so-called SWIFT clearance system, is afraid, I can't really do that. Of course, I don't care about the sanctions, but I can't do that because maybe they'll punish me. So that's a lot of power. But it's not hard to create a bank that doesn't have dollar transactions. And Iran can trade with India, can trade with China, can trade with Russia, can trade with African countries without worry through that alternative. Donald Trump says, no, I'm going to crush that. He in fact said, I already did. I told them, don't do that, and now it's done. I'll predict he's wrong, okay? I will predict that there will be, in the next 10 years, an ample non-dollar trading system, and that anyone that wants to make third-party transactions without using the dollar will have absolutely no problem in doing it, and the US won't be able to dictate any of that. In fact, the sanctions regime, by and large, will collapse over time because the US doesn't have the reach other than its bilateral pressure, and the bilateral pressure is not going to be enough to entice any kind of fundamental change in the other countries. Okay, so still to this day, Netanyahu is trying to get the US to bomb Iran. What's interesting is Iran was making many peace offerings to Biden, all completely ignored. The Biden administration was a complete failure in this regard. They could have changed things. They didn't change anything. So Iran is every day trying to get to the Trump White House. They want to make a deal. They want to open negotiations. Of course they do. Why not? And I, of course, am saying every day, yes, of course the United States should do that. Are you kidding? Why would we not? Netanyahu's already led us to 6 wars. It's enough. It's sickening. Stop. The guy's a terrible, terrible person, actually, in my opinion. And he's properly indicted by the International Criminal Court. Enough. We don't have to go to another war on his behalf. So, will this happen? I don't know.
Another question?
My name is Born. I'm from physics faculty. So I have a question. I was actually first introduced to your name by my late father. He said, there is 35 years ago, he said, like, there is this young American running through the government of Ante Markovic.
Yeah. Are you from Serbia?
Yugoslavia. I'm from Macedonia, but I left.
Where are you from?
Macedonia.
Macedonia. Okay, great.
But I left when it was Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
So Yugoslavia, at that point, you helped the country to become actually the first member of the European Union from Eastern Europe, and we were on the verge to get before starting the war. I think that was the first projection of US power to show that the Russians do not have any say in Europe. And break up the country, I don't know if you can comment on that, how much US had influence in that. That's my first question. Second question was about BRICS, actually. Because, there are two things that the United States kind of project the hegemony. So that's one is military, the second one is dollar. So you predicted like 10 years that this will happen. I mean, this will be a very strong shake-up for the United States because printing money will not be the same. So what's your comment?
So I was advisor to the last federal government of Yugoslavia before the country fell apart. I did not cause it to fall apart. I actually, I gave rather good advice at the end of 1989 and in 1990. And the advice also included things that Europe and the United States should do to help Yugoslavia to stabilize. One of them was don't ask Yugoslavia to pay back debt that was coming due. This is the most normal thing in the world. They rejected that basic advice. And Markovic ended up falling, Milosevic and others, Tudjman and so forth, wanted to break the country apart. But Markovic had an early success. He was quite popular. The inflation fell under the program that I recommended, and it could have succeeded. Why? Who broke it up? I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it was mainly Germany more than the United States, actually. The U.S. was a little preoccupied and not paying so much attention. Germany seemed to really want Croatian independence and did not want Yugoslavia to survive. I don't understand this to this day because I've never had a good discussion with a real German politician who was involved in any of that. It's also true, by the way, that Germany in the 1990s, I'm told more than I knew, was also very strongly pushing for NATO enlargement as well. Partly, they didn't want to be on the boundary. They wanted the border of NATO to be farther away from them towards Russia. And so I'm told that the German military wanted NATO to enlarge and was very enthusiastic that the United States played that role. I tend to blame the U.S. for almost everything. It's generally accurate and it's deserved, but it may be that Germany had an extra hand in this. When it comes to U.S. power projection, you're right. There's the military side. There's the military side. There's the technology, and there is the financial. And if you analyze these carefully, well, on the military, the basic point is superpowers cannot defeat each other. They can only blow up the world. So this is a basic point. We cannot defeat Russia, we cannot defeat China, because if we were defeating them, they would blow up the world. So this is a different world from the balance of power of the 19th century. There's a name for it in political science called the nuclear revolution, which is that the advent of nuclear power and a nuclear deterrent changes fundamentally the geopolitics of big powers. I believe that. My friend John Mearsheimer doesn't believe it as much. He thinks it's okay for big powers to still annoy each other, aggravate each other, press for advantages. I say, please just stay out of each other's backyard and front yard, for that matter, so that we give some space to each other. But on military, I don't believe the U.S. has any decisive advantage. It's got a big military. It can do a lot of damage, but it cannot defeat Russia, it cannot defeat China, and so forth. Second is technological. A lot of the U.S. thinking is we've got a lock on technology. We have the chokehold on something. Now, my view, again, I'm not a technologist, I can ask you, but my reading of history is that there are very rarely these chokeholds. There are temporary advantages, but technology diffuses a lot faster these days than it did, say, in the 3rd century BC, or the 4th century BC, when Alexander's troops had the advantage of the Sarissa. They could keep it. You couldn't read about it in a journal. The Persians never had a chance to catch up, and so forth. But here, everybody knows everything, day by day, every day. It's on video, after all. And you actually watch the Ukraine war, how much technological innovation has come in the last 2 years. So I am very skeptical of choke points. And supposedly AI was our great choke point, and then DeepSeek came a few weeks ago. And whenever I'm in China, I'm just blown away by how much innovation's going on. So I don't believe that there's any technological chokehold on anything right now. That's my second point. Then on the dollar is still the payments currency for about 60% of international transactions. People still use the dollar. It's very convenient to have one dominant currency, one key currency, we call it in economics. But if the US hadn't abused that privilege in many, many ways, it probably could stay the key currency. But the US has abused it, both in terms of its financial policies, because we're in big debt and monetary policy is not very credible and so forth, but also in geopolitical terms, because the dollar was weaponized. Capture Russia's assets, capture Venezuela's assets, capture Iran's assets, capture Afghanistan's assets, capture North Korea's assets. If you do that long enough, others won't use the dollar. If you're going to have a fight with the US government, don't have a lot of dollar holdings. It's fine. Move it to something else first, honestly. So this is my recommendation. Technically, it's not hard to have non-dollar payments. I've designed the Slovene tolar. I designed the Estonian kroon. I could do it. It wasn't so hard. It's not so hard to make an alternative payment system. Trump's threat is meaningless, in my opinion. It may, by the way, scare the Brazilians just a little bit because everyone's a little cautious. Don't talk about it too much. But we're going to have multiple currencies. The renminbi for sure is going to be internationalized, and maybe a number of others as well. So I don't see the U.S. will be a powerful country, cannot be invaded, has no security risk at all, except if we blow up the world, or except if we collapse internally from some kind of absolute stupidity. So we have potentially a unique society of diversity. This is our greatest strength, for sure, in this country, that we are a highly diverse society that functions most of the time. And that is a great calling card. That's almost impossible to achieve other than through experience. In New York City, which I love living in, we hear English once in a while. There are 200 languages spoken. It's marvelous. And it works, kind of, most of the time. And that's our greatest strength. And that's a strength that no one else can take, actually. That's intrinsic to the history of the country and to its demography and all the rest. It's viewed as a great weakness, but of course it's a great strength. So if we can figure that out, things will be okay.
Thank you. There is another question. Now, we are running out of time. So there is a reception outside. And so, you can ask also your questions outside. There is one here. I know. It's you can ask at the reception. You can talk to him. He's there. Okay, please.
I am Charlotte. I'm from the School of Arts and Sciences. And thank you for the fascinating talk. During the talk, you mentioned Kaya's book, The End of History.
Yes.
And later, his advisor, also at Harvard, wrote an article, Clash of Civilizations,
yes,
to counter his arguments. The Western civilization, Orthodox civilization, Asian civilization, including China, India, and the Southeast Asian countries, and the Middle East civilization. So in your opinion, do you think the framework by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, is still relevant in explaining today's geopolitical tensions?
Let me close. We'll make this the last question. The first word of the program, PPE, is philosophy. And that's where I started. And I'll start with Confucian philosophy. Confucian philosophy is about harmony in diversity. And it is that you don't need uniformity, but you do need harmony. And my view of the Confucian idea is that there is no inevitability of clash. So there's no reason why diverse cultures and civilizations should clash with each other. What Confucius tried to tell us was, behave yourself. Act like a gentleman, was how he put it, with Ren, and with propriety, and understand proper relationships, and behave, and have reciprocity, because he loved the golden rule. To my mind, this is what's wrong with many of the theories around. My friend John Mearsheimer's big book, it's a fascinating, wonderful book, and he's a great scholar, is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Okay. I want something different. I want the solution to that, because we can't afford tragedy. Fukuyama's idea was the end of history, and the last man, he called it. And the end of history was, there's one civilization. It's the Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy, so-called civilization, and now it has proven its superiority over all the rest. Wrong. Then there is Sam Huntington's theory. He was very kind to me. He was my colleague at Harvard, very, very, very nice man. But he said, we're going to clash. And of course, he depicted what was then the dominant geopolitical issue, the war on terror, as a fighting across civilizations. I don't think so at all. Not only for the footnote that the United States created al-Qaeda as a CIA operation in Afghanistan, and the group that just took power in Syria, the United States and Israel backed for the last 30 years. We should understand this is geopolitics, not a clash of civilizations. And there's no reason in the world that we should be living in 1095 in the Crusades, where the Christians and the Muslims are fighting with each other, for heaven's sake. So we could do better than that. So I think Sam Huntington, of course, he was trying to be descriptive and not prescriptive, and maybe predictive. But the difference with philosophy, for me, and especially ethics, and especially political ethics, is not about prediction. It's not about description. It is about prescription. What should we do as human beings to solve our problems? That's what ethics is. Ethics is a self-help manual, how to live properly. So I don't accept a book that is The Clash of Civilizations or a book that is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I want a book that explains how to get along. A good starting point is the Analects of Confucius, for example. Or another one is the Nicomachean Ethics. So there's plenty of guides, but I think these analyses are wrong. They very much understate the potential to cooperate. They very much understate the common interests that we have. They very much overstate the clash of interests or the clash of vision in the world. And they're mostly based on an idea that I'll end here where I started, that I can't even understand. What does it mean that you want to be the number one in the world? How about just being good, happy, and at peace. Thank you very much. Okay, very good.
Yeah, so if you'd like to please join us, we have a reception just outside here in the main lobby.
Yeah, okay.